I just want to give you all a heads up. Dr. Ridenour's presentation is anything like last year's presentation. You can find boxes of tissues over here and at the back of the room. So next up we have Dr. Jeremy Ridenour. He is the Director of Psychological Testing and a staff psychologist at the Austin Riggs Center. His research interests includes the psychological assessment of personality disorders and the psychotherapeutic treatment of psychosis through an emphasis on metacognition and mentalization. Please welcome Dr. Jeremy Ridenour.
All right, first I want to give thanks to Ellen Horn and Gould Farm for hosting the conference, as well as Windhorst and Riggs for what they've contributed as well. So I'll be talking today about shame and stigma and psychotherapy for psychosis. This is a paper I'm working on with some colleagues, so I want to also acknowledge them. That includes Jay Ham, Bethany Leonhardt, John Leitziker, Ben Buck, and Brett Thatcher. So this paper on shame comes out of a series of papers we've been working on over the last couple of years that are looking at the core emotional and interpersonal processes that are central to psychosis. Past papers include discussions about grief, despair and hope, trust, fear, and loneliness. That's what I talked about last year. But this year I want to talk about shame and how it's relevant to the experience of psychosis. But this morning I was thinking a little bit more about shame and its relationship to truth. I was recalling a podcast my wife and I listened to a year ago. We were driving to DC with our kids to visit my brother, and we were listening to this woman who writes about being a mother and talked about how, because when I was thinking about the papers I've written about, like, oh, they're all about negative emotions on some level, and she made the point that there are no such things as positive or negative emotions. As a parent, the only things that matter is what the true emotion is and helping her children tell the truth about what they're feeling. And so it got me thinking about what is the relationship between shame and truth. And two things came to mind this morning as I was thinking about that. The first is that in my own life, I think about moments of shame. It often has to do when I failed to tell the truth, when I didn't have the courage to say what I thought, to stick up for someone or for myself. And I thought then about the experience of shame. Of course, lying, as well, often is an expression of shame or guilt. But then I also was thinking as a psychoanalyst that telling the truth about who we are often requires confrontations with shame, that the path towards truth can be lined with shame, in fact, because it's difficult to tell our secrets, to confront our failures, the tragedies and the traumas of our lives. My analyst actually wrote a paper before he died talking about how to die well. And he talked about his wish that he didn't have to die, his love for life. But he also talked about one of the ways to have integrity at the moment of death and the facing of death is to be able to confront the failures of one's life, the way you weren't a good husband or a father, the struggles at work, the inability to make money and provide. And I do think there's something about the difficulty of telling the truth and the capacity to stomach shame that I think is important. And really all these papers I think have been about that struggle. How do we help people tell the truth about their experiences in a world that doesn't often want to hear about it? Experiences that are harrowing, fragmenting, and then as well, I think in the experience trying to work with people who are facing such difficult processes and mental states, that we also confront the truth about our humanity, our limitations, and I think that requires facing shame. Get more into the paper now. I think also throughout I'm going to kind of ad-lib a little bit because I've already written this and I sort of know what I'm going to say, and I get kind of bored, so I need to kind of go on tangents a little bit. So shame is an important emotion in the daily lives of people with psychosis and correlated with heightened symptom expression. It's also associated with a range of negative outcomes, including post-psychotic depression, PTSD symptoms following a psychotic episode, non-adherence to medications, and disengagement from clinical services. Nevertheless, it's often neglected in the psychosis literature. One reason that shame may be overlooked is that people are often ashamed of their shame, and it can be concealed behind silence, withdrawal, dismissiveness, or hostility. Another issue is that it can be challenging to distinguish between shame and stigma, and the two are often equated, or when stigma is discussed, shame usually is ignored. Finally, while there are some available psychotherapeutic treatments for psychosis and shame, most notably CBT and also compassion-focused therapy, less has been written about how shame is a complex interpersonal process that is often contagious and can shut down the ability to reflect upon one's own mind and the mind of others. This poses special challenges to psychotherapy, given the prominence of shame in the experience of psychosis, and since psychosis itself often impairs one's ability to reflect on one's own mind and the mind of other people. In light of this, a psychotherapy approach aimed at both developing these reflective capabilities and the capacity to make meaning may have particular value in responding to shame. In response to this, I'll attempt to clarify some of the key conceptual issues related to shame and its role in the experience of psychosis. I'll try to put forward a definition of shame that distinguishes it from both guilt and stigma, and we'll consider the relevance of both internal and external shame. Next, we'll discuss some of the developmental antecedents of shame, how it emerges interpersonally. I do believe shame is very much related to the body, although I don't think it's just constricted to the body, but I think it emerges there. Finally, I'll discuss the research between shame and psychosis, look at some first-person accounts, and then describe some 4 key therapeutic principles to address and respond to shame. Okay, so defining and developing shame. Distinguishing shame from other self-conscious emotions, such as guilt or embarrassment, and from social realities such as stigma can be challenging. Much has been written about the ways to differentiate guilt from shame, with many authors arguing that guilt is an emotion that arises when a person feels remorse about their actions and their impact on others. By contrast, shame is less focused on personal responsibility and instead reflects a sense of personal inadequacy, especially when there's a gap between the ideal and the actual self. In moments of shame, the individual may feel powerless to change the situation, and the natural tendency is to begin blushing, lowering one's gaze, or withdrawing altogether to avoid the exposure of these perceived flaws to others. Shame may have evolved to help people detect social threat and thereby alter their behavior to conform to group standards and maintain acceptance. I will say, too, getting into the whole relationship between guilt and shame has been interesting. I read a paper, which I'll talk a little bit about later, by Otto Will, who's a former medical director at Riggs, and he reflected on the sense of shame and psychosis. This is a paper that came out in the 80s, and he basically makes the point, which kind of confused me, was that he didn't have the experience of his patients talking about shame, which I thought was interesting. And I think part of what I realized in this research is that I wonder the ways in which we sort of use words differently, like the ways that guilt is no longer as common in our language and shame has come to replace it. I mean, I have ways of differentiating it here, but it was interesting to me that that was not something he heard about, which may have reflected the effort to hide, but I also wondered just how words are used, how terms evolve. Guilt has obviously a more religious or legal context. Shame, to me, though, seems to be something more prominent, certainly in psychoanalysis in the last 40, 50 years. Kohut and Kernberg have written quite a bit on it. Go back to the paper. Theorists of shame have consistently distinguished between internal and external shame. Internal shame arises when a person cannot meet their own standards, which often results in self-criticism. One way to think about self-criticism, actually, is that it's an effort of the ideal self to beat up on the actual self. It's an effort to almost restore a belief in sort of one's own ego ideals or the ideal self. There's a wonderful paper by the psychoanalyst Stephen Cooper that came out about 15 years ago on self-criticism and unconscious grandiosity, which got me thinking a little bit about, how obviously shame has a relationship to grandiosity, to the ideal self. But he points out that sometimes people criticize themselves, mock themselves, beat up on themselves when they're trying to sort of hold on to some ideal version of themselves. I remember this a couple years ago, at work one day, we were in a clinical staff meeting. I said something, and then I realized I was back in my office and that I had misused the word. I had used the wrong word, and I was sort of berating myself for not having the right vocabulary, appearing stupid. And it was sort of an interesting moment where I was reflecting on, did I really think I was never going to use the wrong word in a clinical staff meeting? I've been working there for 11 years. And so I felt this shame, and then I felt this shame about the feeling of shame, and then wondered about my own grandiosity. So, they're all kind of interlinked. So that's internal shame. Again, it's an effort to sort of manage self-criticism. External shame emerges when a person believes that others see them in a negative light. Since external shame has a strong correlation with stigma, they're often used interchangeably in the literature, with stigma being seen as the cause of shame. Stigma refers to the sociocultural conception of what's unacceptable within a given group, and people who embody these undesirable characteristics are often denigrated or disempowered. A person then who adopts these beliefs may develop internalized stigma and live under the constant threat of encountering stigma in the community or just in their own lives. While the relationship between stigma and shame is complex, I'd argue that stigma cannot fully account for shame, especially internal shame, which is highly individual based on a person's life history. Regarding the development of shame, Erickson posited that shame develops early in life when a child feels a loss of personal autonomy or an inability to control the body and navigate the world successfully. Shame is often associated with the body and related to the loss of physical control that emerges in early childhood, and I think also affects the elderly when they start to lose bodily autonomy and require more physical assistance. Some theorists have suggested that early experiences of being chronically shamed can warp an individual's core schemas of self and other and result in shame proneness and the loss of self-cohesion. Such individuals are hypervigilant to the possibility of being humiliated, which can result in shame anxiety or the chronic anticipation of being shamed. So based on this brief review, I'd argue that shame surfaces when an individual feels a fundamental flaw is exposed that is often accompanied by a loss of agency and inability to alter the situation. Shame may be externally focused on social rejection or be internal based on an inability to meet one's own standards or embarrassments about one's own bodily or psychological limitations. One crucial element of shame is that people often feel a loss of control and an inability to close the gap between the actual and the ideal self. Thinking more about shame, I was just going through my own mind about my own experiences and how it's emerged in my life, thinking about sort of times in my life when I've had to confront mental or physical incompetence, essentially, or perceived incompetence. One is that when I went to college, part of my whole identity in high school was that I was very good at math. I was the kind of kid who did math competitions, and I was pretty good. But then I went to college, and I grew up in a small town in Texas, and I went to a big university, and I realized I was taking all these math classes that I hit an intellectual ceiling for the first time in my life, which was very difficult. I had a lot of questions about my identity. I ended up changing my major. But it's a real moment where I could not hold on to this vision of myself, and then I had a choice about what do I do when I confront that feeling of shame and experience a limitation. And I had to, of course, pivot and also work on my ego ideals. This is part of what young adults are working on. They have great ideals, they go out into the world, they confront limitations, and then they have a choice. What do they do when they face those limitations? It can be difficult, and it can be hard to change one's ideas because it requires working on one's identity. I also think a little more about the phenomenology of shame. How do I experience in my own mind? And my major experience is that it's kind of a haunting emotion. It's an emotion that kind of comes up every so often. It whispers in moments of failure. It reminds me of things I'm embarrassed of. And sometimes my physical reaction is to flinch, like I'm actually trying to get it out of my system. I think shame exists right under the skin. You know, it's a very uncomfortable, physical, disquieting experience that people will do just about anything to get away from. The one thing I realized writing this paper too is that I'm sort of like saying shame is bad, right? And you know, a lot of philosophers will write about shame is bad. Martha Nussbaum writes about this, but guilt is a good thing. Guilt, leads to responsibility. One of my co-authors in this paper, John Lysaker, is a moral philosopher, and he and I were arguing about how to think about shame and the way it's also a pro-social emotion, because obviously the absence of shame is a problem. If you don't have shame, you're shameless, you might have tendencies towards narcissism or psychopathy. So there's a healthy degree of shame, but I don't think of shame as just being something society imposes on you, but it can also be something that one identifies with social values, internalizes them, and then tries to live up to them. It can be a sort of aspirational thing, which I'll talk more about. So I'm trying to balance something. Of course, excessive shame is a problem, but I do think nevertheless developing the ability to face shame, to become more competent in handling of it is an important developmental achievement. Another thing that's not in the paper, but I wanted to mention, is that there was an interesting cross-cultural study I read from Indonesia in this community, where they were talking about the relationship between shame and psychosis and how they think about the two. One way they think about how they know when someone's becoming psychotic is that someone starts to behave in ways that essentially ignore cultural values or kind of social, basically social rituals, and they become essentially shameless in those moments by ignoring important kind of holidays or rituals or respect between elders, and they actually see recovery as being about the restoration of shame. This person is coming back into the fold and is realizing, I violated these social customs, I want to come back and honor them. And so it made me think too about how the loss of shame and the recovery of shame is an important thing as people come back into the human community. The last thing I will say, as a parent of a 5-year-old, I sort of underestimated the power of shame. My son is very driven. He's very physically strong. He does a lot of climbing with his mom. But I was surprised by he really wants to do a good job, and when he doesn't do a good job, he gets very angry with himself. And I sort of had this somewhat naive fantasy that I could just somehow get between him and his shame and talk him through it, provide some encouragement. And I'm aware, of course, young children are developing the capacity to manage shame, 5, 6, 7, that it's a very powerful feeling that I find myself being unable to get between him and his own experiences of shame, which is evident with him, but I think more generally for all of us, it's very hard to let someone get between our shame and ourselves. And so just the profound power of it, it's automatic and it's very difficult. He often wants to hide or run to his room when he can't master a physical challenge in particular. That brings up those experiences of shame. Okay, so going back to psychosis, I want to talk about the sources of shame. Shame has been found to be linked to psychosis, with higher levels of shame correlating with heightened psychotic symptoms. People who are ultra-high risk for developing schizophrenia report higher levels of shame compared to the general population. In fact, a recent study that uses ecological momentary assessment basically asked people with psychosis to report on their daily experiences, describe their emotions. So they asked about different emotions: fear, anger, anxiety, and shame. And they discovered that shame was the most central negative emotion in the daily lives of people with psychosis, and that it was potentially the cause of symptoms and also a reaction to symptoms. So say someone is at the grocery store trying to buy some groceries, they're talking to the cashier, and they all of a sudden start hearing a voice. They might start to feel ashamed about becoming symptomatic in public and not being able to control it. McCarthy-Jones has theorized that shame may in fact cause auditory verbal hallucinations, noting that the content of voices is often associated with shame, guilt, or unworthiness, although a more recent meta-analysis in the Schizophrenia Bulletin didn't find a significant correlation between hallucinations and shame. The most robust research finding in the literature is a strong association between paranoia and shame, especially external shame. External shame and paranoia are conceptually linked because both are connected to the fears of judgment, suspicious thinking, and wariness about receiving unwanted attention from others. Paranoid hypervigilance may drive the person to be on the lookout for external threats that may be humiliating, and shameful withdrawal can also exacerbate paranoia, since the person is left alone with suspicions that can't be shared with and possibly modified by social encounters. In addition to symptoms, harmful social interactions can be a source of shame. In fact, 87% of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia report encountering stigma, and schizophrenia has consistently been found to be the most stigmatized mental disorder. People who hold stigmatizing beliefs may assume that people with psychosis are dangerous, unpredictable, lazy, whatever it might be. A recent study found that comparing people with schizophrenia, those with bipolar disorder, the rates of internalized stigma are much higher for people with schizophrenia, which I think, of course, reflects social prejudice as well. But people are also then adopting these beliefs, and they become central to their identity. Accepting a psychiatric diagnosis also can impact a person's identity, especially for someone who is prone to shame, and result in internalized stigma, feelings of hopelessness, or defectiveness. Experiences of trauma, which are common for people with psychosis, may also be a source of shame, as shame often develops in the aftermath of trauma. An interesting study I read pointed out that if you look at the emotional reaction people have to trauma, that it's shame but not guilt that sort of predicts the ongoing recurrence of PTSD symptoms. People can feel guilty about their trauma, but actually feeling ashamed of it, feeling that loss of control, that loss of dignity, that recurrent feeling keeps the symptoms going in a way. A study by Wasserman and colleagues found that expressed emotion, a family communication pattern that's associated with criticism, hostility, or over-involvement, and is known to predict poorer prognosis for people with psychosis, was higher in relatives of people with schizophrenia who harbor significant feelings of shame or guilt about having a family member with a mental illness. It seems like then in response to those feelings of shame and guilt, they may respond by either blaming their family member or working so hard to sort of counteract those feelings. So people who feel a great deal of shame about having, say, a brother or sister or parent with schizophrenia, then that can lead to sort of communication patterns that only increase the feelings of shame and isolation. Encountering stigma or experiencing trauma may leave a legacy of shame that the individual may try to hide. These painful experiences may explain why people with psychosis report higher levels of shame and self-criticism, which makes it difficult to have self-compassion. Finally, many people have encounters within the mental health system that can be humiliating, especially when it involves physical restraints, involuntary admission to the hospital, forced medications, or weight changes due to medications. A final major source of shame is that people are often embarrassed by the experience of psychosis itself. Numerous first-person accounts of psychosis describe people who wrestle with feelings of self-blame and shame after a psychotic episode, believing that they caused it, even though they realized they weren't fully in control of what was happening. We've argued before in the past that self-blame may also serve as a defense against feelings of grief about the loss of agency during a psychotic episode. One study found that people with psychosis often felt ashamed of having to acknowledge that their thoughts were delusional or their perceptions were altered during the experience. Such feelings of shame can be intensified if the individual broadcasted these beliefs somehow by acting in public, sending messages on social media, and in other ways embarrassing themselves. Fontaine and colleagues found that people who experienced psychosis also carried shame because they were confused about what was real and what was imaginary, which resulted in a sense of kind of mental instability. For instance, this is an example, a patient who had sexual delusions when psychotic believed that he had masturbated in front of the nurses while in an inpatient unit. It took weeks for him to recognize that this did not in fact happen, and yet he continued to feel embarrassed about the loss of control over his mind and body during the psychotic episode. Okay, so I've laid out the sources of shame. Now I want to talk about how to address it. So one of the things that was influential reading these papers was that I was sort of interested in this approach that's been advocated by Dolezal and Gibson. They've talked about, these days everyone's talking about trauma-informed care, and they are advocated for the importance of shame-sensitive practice, which would have, first off, acknowledge the ubiquity of shame and how it affects both patients and clinicians. They've written this from a public health perspective, but I think it's obviously applicable to how we deliver mental health care as well. They argue for the importance of clinicians developing shame competence and the ability to recognize it even when it's hidden. Furthermore, they describe how clinicians can create a safe atmosphere that allows for the disclosure of painful life experiences by being aware of how shame may emerge based on the person's unique life history and how to be sensitive in their use of language and approach when asking questions. Applied to psychosis, so whenever I write papers, there's always this issue about branding it. How do you want to brand it? What's the labels you want to use? I've written about mentalization, but I write with a lot of friends who developed this sort of evidence-based therapy called metacognitive reflection and insight therapy. It's the abbreviation's MERIT, so I'm going to talk about that, but I think this really applies to any good therapy. MERIT's an integrative psychotherapy approach that emphasizes the promotion of patient agency and enhanced metacognition while attending to the presence of stigma. The MERIT literature and the empirical metacognitive research from which it was developed have demonstrated repeatedly that individuals with severe mental illness commonly experiences significant difficulties in the spectrum of reflective mental capacities referred to as metacognition. Okay, metacognition is a big word. It basically just means cognition about cognition, how one thinks about one's own thoughts. They've operationalized it in a scale that looks at 4 different components, which I'll just lay out briefly. First is the ability to self-reflect. Do you realize you're having thoughts? Do you realize that thoughts belong to you? Do you realize the difference between thoughts and wishes and feelings? Can you distinguish between feelings? And then can you eventually use all these thoughts and feelings to create a narrative about who you are and how you've come to be? Then there's the awareness of the other's mind. Can you differentiate between your thoughts and someone else's thoughts? And can you name their emotions? And you can develop more complexity. A third component is decentration. They take that from Piaget, who talked about how around the ages of 7 to 11, children start to begin to move out of the egocentrism sphere where they think everything has to do with their own, basically, reality. People are, having reactions based only on what's going on with them. And then you see this sometimes in paranoid states of mind. People lose the ability to think that anything is happening that might be incidental. They think they're at the center of the universe, and often a sort of negative plot. And then the fourth component of metacognition is mastery, which is basically the ability to articulate challenges that are realistic and then to use knowledge about self and others to then make decisions about how you want to adapt in the world. Okay. So in Merit, therapists use the therapeutic relationship as an intersubjective space within which to help people think about their lives, make sense of their experiences, and deepen their capacity for self-reflection. For individuals with severe metacognitive impairments, and I should say too, what they find too is that people with psychosis uniquely have challenges with this compared to even other psychotic disorders, psychotic depression, bipolar disorder. This is a unique problem, and it kind of goes back to Bloiler, who thought that sort of breakdowns in fundamental capacities to think and an awareness are central. So that these inability, this difficulty with metacognition can make it very difficult, first, to even identify emotions, second, to distinguish between them. Oh, I'm feeling shame. And of course, as one becomes aware of shame, for people who are already feeling fragmented, it can fragment them even further. I think all of us, in moments of severe shame, cannot think, cannot actually gain any perspective on what's going on, can't distinguish between them. This is how I'm feeling. Does everyone else think this about me in this moment? Those kind of boundaries break down. Of course, if someone's already having that problem, the presence of shame will make things even harder. Helping patients to strengthen their capacity to reflect on their experiences in the mind of others may be particularly relevant, as shame threatens down the capacity to reflect. So now I'm going to outline 4 principles: attending to shame and its concealment, addressing external shame, reckoning with internal shame, and exploring shame within the therapeutic relationship. Okay, so attending to shame and its concealments. Shame is such a painful emotion for people that people will do anything in their power to avoid it and strive to conceal it when it does arise. People with psychosis report high levels of shame, and yet there are barriers to sharing it openly in therapy. First, as I kind of already mentioned, for people who have impairments in metacognition, they may not even realize that they're experiencing shame. Sandra Buechler wrote this paper recently that I like, where she makes the point that there are often difficulties distinguishing between, for instance, shame and anger, shame and guilt, or shame and anxiety. These things blur together in people's minds. So making these distinctions with ourselves is difficult. Certainly for someone who's feeling a lot of stress, isolation, or fragmentation, it becomes even more difficult. When shame does emerge, it may also threaten to further fragment the person's sense of self and impair their ability to distinguish between their mind and the minds of others, leading to further confusion. Second, people with psychosis have various ways of disguising their shame. They may project it onto others, who are then seen as incompetent or humiliating. Alternatively, they may conceal feelings of shame and inadequacy by becoming grandiose or contemptuous. For instance, I supervised someone who worked with this person with schizophrenia who sort of began therapy sessions saying that they had 10 PhDs, and it became very clear that they were extremely self-conscious about working with someone who had a PhD and were trying in some ways, I think, to feel stronger, to feel better, even though they didn't have a high school degree. And it seems like there was an effort to, again, protect the self. With this patient, the therapist would be alerted to the fact that the patient may be especially insecure about intelligence or prestige, and try to learn about why the patient has come to value these characteristics so highly. When working with people who are severely defended against exposing shameful vulnerabilities, it's useful to remember that shame is such an awful feeling that it often leaves people feeling unworthy of love. If you really feel deep shame, you often think, no one will ever love me. So this is a very difficult experience to enter into, and I think for all of us, we do a lot to ignore it and shy away from it. Key to the application of merit is the therapist's continuous attention to the patient's motives, wishes, intentions in the moment in session. This is what they call the patient's agenda. What are they seeking? What are they looking for when they're saying this? In this regard, this first practice element, attending to the patient agenda, is specifically geared at aiding the therapist and patient to bring to light what the patient's seeking, which might include a desire to conceal shame. Additionally, merit's second practice element, which introduces the therapist's mind, can assist people with psychosis in reflecting on the internal states of another person. If the therapist would try to normalize feelings of shame by potentially sharing their own experiences, it may allow reflective space within therapy to explore how shame can be a normal part of the human experience and integrate it into a larger sense of one's story, rather than being something that has to be kept out and defended against. Okay, the second practice element is addressing external shame. As mentioned above, a major finding in the literature is that external shame is linked to both paranoia and stigma. Regarding paranoia, patients may come to sessions with a focus on external agents who are out to hurt or humiliate them. To recognize the undercurrents of shame and paranoia, the therapist should try to ascertain how the patient feels about the unwanted attention. In the cognitive literature, they often talk about different types of paranoia. There's like the bad me paranoia, and then there's the poor me paranoia. The bad me people tend to feel like they deserve it, that they're guilty, and therefore the shame is higher. People who have the sort of poor me paranoia, who feel like the victims of unwanted attention and persecution, clearly their shame is going to be lower, and they often have higher sort of incidence of grandiose delusions. So we're kind of interested in how is the sort of paranoia being narrated, how is it being understood, and to also understand that one of the major drivers of paranoia is an impaired capacity to reflect upon the mental states of others. If a patient struggles to think flexibly about the complex motivations of others, it's easy to default to more simple kind of heuristics and shortcuts, which includes, they're out to get me. So for example, a patient told her therapist that she thinks the grocery store cashier wants to hurt her because she gave her a dirty look when paying for groceries with her SNAP benefits. Furthermore, she wonders if the cashier may be scheming with others who want to poison her food for some unstated reason. In the session, the therapist asked for the patient to just provide sort of detailed observations about what happened, about the interaction, including her feelings about paying with SNAP benefits. In this instance, in an effort to help the patient consider a range of possibilities, the therapist and patient outlined various possibilities, including the patient's shame and judgment that may have been projected onto the cashier's potential prejudice and judgment that may have been against people receiving government assistance, the cashier's possible annoyance that may have been completely unrelated to the interaction, and the impact of the cashier touching the patient's food, and then the anxiety it elicited. What's essential is not to try to correct the patient's suspicious attributions, but instead to create the ability to think together about a range of possibilities to promote greater cognitive flexibility and metacognitive awareness that the patient's thoughts and emotions, including shame, may be coloring her interpretations. Shame is often the enemy of nuance. It results in all or nothing thinking that prevents people from making distinctions between their internal feelings and their external perceptions. It's very hard to see other people clearly when you're filled with shame. These efforts to assist the patient to think more flexibly and thereby aid them in making meaning and developing more effective strategies for responding to problems is a foundational goal of merit and is directly implicated in the expectations that in each session that therapists offer interventions that promote increased capacity for reflecting on self, others, and social contexts. In addition to paranoia, therapists should also be sensitive to the prevalence of stigma and psychosis. I think this is a hard thing to think about because I think it's easy to point to like the obvious elements of stigma, sort of projections of violence or incompetence into people with psychosis, but there's also ways I think it manifests more subtly, and I think we can debate about what those are. People who, I'll get into this example. So therapists should be attentive to their use of language and recognize that patients have likely encountered stigma, both in the community and within the mental health system. Experience of stigma can cause people to withdraw from help and therefore interfere with recovery. Stigma also may manifest more subtly in interactions and impact the therapy process. For instance, a patient with a history of religious delusions expressed wariness about talking about his religious experiences in therapy due to his fears that his therapist would think he was becoming psychotic again. Upon reflection, the therapist was able to notice that she was hesitant to explore religious matters with the patient because it was challenging to differentiate between religious experiences and grandiose ideas. In response to this anxiety, the therapist tended to subtly steer conversations away from religious and spiritual topics, and the patient noted that his mother also became more anxious whenever he read the Bible. The therapist was able to acknowledge aloud her anxiety and shared that she had unwittingly pushed the conversation away from religion because she worried it might worsen the patient's confusion, which she realized was actually stigmatizing of the patient's legitimate religious experiences that weren't simply the byproduct of mental illness. Okay. Now, reckoning with internal shame. Beyond external shame, many people will enter therapy contending with their own shame about their psychosis or just related feelings of personal failure, the everyday experience of shame that we all have. Many patients experience heightened feelings of shame following a psychotic episode, especially as they reflect upon the ways they lost control of their mind and behaviors. It can be very painful for patients to sort of read paranoid text messages they sent to loved ones or to recall embarrassing ways they acted in public. It's interesting, actually, at Riggs, I've been surprised at how much, healing happens when someone has a psychotic episode within the community and they find that they're not totally cast out. Like it's a very powerful experience. Sometimes people don't manage it. Sometimes people do things that leave them kind of being on the outside. But for people who can sort of maintain the connection, it's enormously powerful. I think partly because someone is sort of at the edge of the human experience, and somehow they're not being rejected at that moment. So it can be, I think, very powerful and also very painful, because then you have people witnessing an experience that can be, somewhat traumatic to see their friend lose their mind for a moment and then hopefully come back. Additionally, patients may feel ashamed of their confusion and the ways they continue to struggle to organize their thoughts and communicate clearly. For instance, a young female patient expressed shame about the fact that she continued to have intrusive and unwanted associations that she was trying to ignore. At times, she would almost idealize her previous psychotic state of mind, because during that period, she felt a sense of confidence and certainty about what was real. In the present, she was often ashamed of the loose connections in her mind, filled with doubt, which left her worried of her mind and worried that her thoughts would seem off to others. This was especially challenging because she was an artist, and she'd often relied on her associative mind to create art, and started to not know if she could really trust, is this creativity, is this madness, and it led to a lot of doubt and worries. One way for the therapist to help address this problem is to work together with the patient to sort of identify the factors that might intensify confusion. What are the emotional or interpersonal factors? And then hopefully to help the patient develop more insight and self-compassion. In addition to shame about psychosis, many patients experience shame about the ways their mental health problems have disrupted their life goals, impaired their sense of agency, and prevented them from being present for loved ones. A patient who can't meet their personal goals might become ashamed of the ways they felt left behind by their peers, diminishing their sense of competence and self-worth. Feelings of shame shine a light on the areas of perceived flaws that reveal a gap again between the ideal and the actual self. When working with patients around these sensitive topics, therapists should keep a couple principles in mind. I've said this before, but shame is a very sticky emotion that is hard to scrub away. It can be hard to get between someone and their own shame, as these feelings often reveal core negative beliefs about the self. So rather than trying to argue or even attenuate shame or tell the patient it's excessive, it's at first important to understand what the shame reveals about the person's values and aspirations. Who are you trying to be, and why is this so in conflict with that? How do I understand what's the sort of aspirational element behind the shame? Another way to lessen a sense of shame is by helping the patient develop more self-acceptance and compassion for their struggles when symptomatic. Rather than encouraging resignation, we believe that helping a patient gain a clear perspective on their strengths and limitations also includes reckoning with grief, grieving what's been lost in the aftermath of psychosis, and trying to accept ongoing limitations. That may include, I have to take medications for the foreseeable future, and that's difficult, and trying to grieve that and sort of also, again, work on what is the ideal self I'm aiming to be, and how realistic is that given my situation, and how can I also sort of live with reality but not give up hope. Grieving these losses may ultimately enable the patient to accept perceived flaws, although the process will be especially painful as the person confronts ways they've both disappointed themselves and others. Okay, finally, I want to talk about exploring shame within the therapeutic relationship. Finally, shame can emerge within the therapeutic relationship and might disrupt the alliance or lead to strained communication. Otto Will wrote about how the therapist's personal experience of shame can impact how they respond to their shame and whether they might ignore it or become overwhelmed by it in session. Being aware of our own shameful vulnerabilities and how we typically handle them, how we typically handle such discomfort may enable us to develop the reflective capacity to notice the signs that we're feeling ashamed, my face is feeling flushed, and to determine what gave rise to such a reaction. Sandra Buechler has argued that curiosity may be the antidote to shame, and as challenging as it can be, it's important for therapists to try to understand what's behind the reaction. Does it just reflect a personal insecurity? Is it possible that I'm picking up on the patient's disavowed shame? They're kind of talking down to me, telling me I'm incompetent. Are they feeling incompetent in this moment? What am I actually feeling? And then why does shame emerge in this moment? What is it saying about sort of the fragile space between? As much as people naturally turn away from shame, psychotherapy is an opportunity to try to slow down and attempt to understand these fragile moments. And it's imperative that therapists have the patience and self-compassion to figure out what's going on. One value of this approach is that it can disrupt the transmission of shame, which is naturally contagious and can spread from one party to the next. If we're feeling shame, it's somewhat natural to dump it on the other person, to externalize it, to try to escape it and project it. Another potential issue is when the therapist tries to act in an omnipotent way, I think this was in the last talk, and sort of attempt to heroically save the patient from the psychosis. Searles wrote about the dedicated physician and how sometimes there's sort of this romantic notion, I'm going to save the patient from schizophrenia, and of course, in many ways, that's an effort by the therapist to jettison their own feelings of shame and limitation, and also cast the patient into the helpless sort of victim role. I also was thinking about my own experience of shame, more personally, working with people who are psychotic. And a couple of years ago, I had this difficult time where I had two patients at the same time who were going through a psychotic episode. And I remember feeling a combination of things. And this is how I often feel when I'm seeing someone become psychotic. The first is that feeling of dread, then the pit in your stomach where you don't know what's going to happen, but you're quite worried, you feel helpless, and you are sort of praying and hoping that something can happen, but you feel that helplessness. Then I felt this sort of feelings of guilt that I let them down, I'm not doing my job. Then I had this sort of broader experience of shame, like, why am I writing all these papers if I can't help the basic people I'm working with? What are my colleagues going to think about me? And so I just started, getting into the sort of shame reaction. And I think that that's one of the challenges, is sort of what to do with those feelings, how to talk about them. And again, I thought about too, like what does that say about my own grandiosity, that I'm feeling ashamed, like as if I could stop someone from becoming psychotic. I mean, I don't have that power, none of us do. We try to help people as much as we can, but I think that sometimes we can give ourselves too much power and in some ways, again, disempower the patient, and it creates maybe unnecessary shame in those moments. Another way that shame can manifest in a therapeutic relationship is related to the patient's conflicts about dependency. Some have argued that shame arises when a person feels physically dependent or reliant on another. They argue that shame is also likely to manifest when a patient may become aware of needs for connection that may feel excessive or problematic. People with psychosis may be quite conflicted about feelings of closeness with their therapist due to suspiciousness, fragile self of their boundaries, or a history of trauma and abuse. Given these inhibitions, a therapist should recognize that patients may be hesitant to express their longing for connection, as it might feel too humiliating or risky. In fact, feelings of shame may be concealed behind grandiose statements in which the patient elevates themselves above the therapist or speaks in a devaluing way about their need for therapy altogether. Instead, it might be more common for themes of closeness to emerge near the middle or end of treatment as trust builds over time and feelings of shame hopefully diminish. It takes a long time, I think, for attachment needs to sort of come online, and there are, of course, enormous defenses around getting attached, because with attachment, inevitably comes loss and feelings of sadness, so it's risky, of course, to get attached. Finally, shame may also emerge within the therapeutic relationship when patients are more symptomatic or disinhibited. For example, a young man experiencing an acute psychotic state became sexually preoccupied, and in a session with his therapist made sexual advances that were quite out of character for him. As his symptoms began to diminish, he seemed to be avoiding his therapist, who asked him directly if it was due to his behavior during the episode. He agreed this was why he was avoiding coming to sessions, and noted his shame about his behavior. Consistent with Merritt's focus on sharing the therapist's mind as a means to reflect upon the therapeutic relationship, the therapist shared her thoughts with the patient about that moment, and that it seemed clear to her that the patient wasn't quite in his right mind and thinking normally. The therapist then noted that this didn't change her opinion of him, and invited him to talk about what the experience was like and how it may impact their ongoing work. This led to a conversation about the experience of psychosis and what the patient described as a breakdown of boundaries and difficulties in reading social situations and cues, which mirrored other important moments in the patient's life. And they also worked on sort of discussions about how sexual feelings sometimes come up in therapy when people get close. It's normal to talk about it, but of course it can be vulnerable and scary. So there's a couple of major takeaways I want to leave you with. The first is that shame is a subtle emotion, that it's often hiding. It can be hidden behind withdrawal, indifference, grandiosity, or projected onto others. And so we have to be sort of very careful in sort of noticing it, wondering about it. Of course, you can't introduce it before someone's ready, but just to be aware that it's always probably present in the relationship, but it will probably be heavily defended against, like anger. It's a very difficult emotion to share. The second is that shame isn't something that can be simply erased, but it has to be understood, respected, and appreciated for what it says about the patient's sense of values and also their disappointments with what really matters to them. And finally, shame can be the enemy of thought and nuance. In moments of shame, it's important to slow down, to try to reflect upon the process, and to understand what gave rise to such a reaction, to halt the transmission of shame from therapist to patient and from patient to therapist, to really make that reflective space possible so we can understand what's going on in that moment, and to hopefully think together about how to move forward. Thanks.
We have about 15 minutes for questions or comments. So I want to give space for that, but if there are none, then we can head to lunch early.
Shame feels, as you said, it's a tricky, I want to hear more about clinically the attribution of shame to a client. Because as you say, people hide it. My clients used to really use the word shame that much. And then there's this projection thing that you talk about. I've often had the experience. A client doesn't tell me about something, and I think they're ashamed. And then they're not ashamed at all. It's something else going on. And it's my shame is such a subjective emotion. And I often feel like I'm bringing my own standards of shame. Guilt, it feels like I'm often on the same page with my clients, but shame feels much more variable and subjective. So what's a good way of feeling, if that's true, what's a good way of dealing with that clinically?
I think that's an important moment or comment that it is highly personal. That's something that I might feel ashamed of, like, mispronouncing a word might not matter to another person. It's very particular based on someone's values and ideas. And I think we have to also suspend judgment about how someone's going to feel about their symptoms and what they sort of mean to them, and really understand it could be something very specific. I was ashamed of the fact that I didn't show up for class, not that I behaved, what some might think is inappropriately, in a family meeting. So we have to really try to slow down and understand what it's about. I do think that we have to be curious in moments of silence, like what's going on, if there's something that someone's trying to develop the courage to say, and maybe the presence of shame is inhibiting. I also think we have to think about our own, shame, what we try to separate what we find shameful versus what they find shameful, which requires knowing what their values are and what our values are and making distinctions, because it's easy, of course, to assume that this other is the same as the self, but that's a problem actually that happens in psychosis as well, so we want to be careful to do that. But I do think it's one of these emotions that's difficult, that takes a long time for people to talk about, and I think it just takes patience be open to it.
I sometimes think about guilt and shame and think I know what the difference is between them, but I don't really. But so it's very interesting seeing you think about this. And the thought that occurred to me while you were talking is that both guilt and shame draw attention to the self, but guilt is a way of enriching the self with a certain kind of confession. And shame is very different. The acknowledgement of shame doesn't enrich the self. I'm curious any reaction you would have to that.
Yeah, well, one thing I was interested in when I was reading more about the guilt literature is that it's often seen as a kind of an emotion that regulates attachment. It's sort of like, I've hurt you, let's restore the relationship. It is, I think, a more interpersonal emotion in a way. Shame, I think, can be about the other, but it's fundamentally about sort of one closing in on oneself and less about how I affect you and more about how I'm seen or how I see myself from the sort of actual or the ideal self or ego ideal. So I do think it's a less kind of interpersonal emotion, which I think is why, clinically it's been linked to narcissism often a lot, because it's more about how the self's, bigness or smallness. In terms of, I'm not sure what do you mean by enrichment, that like it leads to a more, I'm curious about that.
It's good. There's a positive moral value to owning up, to confessing, to saying, I feel guilty, and that adds something to the self that one doesn't necessarily want to hide. You may want to hide the crime, but not the confession. And there's something different about shame where the confession does not want to be made. The confession wants to be hidden.
And that's why I was trying to connect that shame often leaves people feeling unworthy of love, whereas I think guilt is more valorized in a sense that it is a kind of moral thing that one is sort of taking responsibility, whereas shame you may or may not think I should feel ashamed about something. So that sort of personal element, I think, is why it often is more vulnerable in a way than, say, guilt, which is, you could say, more objective in a way. It's a forensic concept. It's, in the law, you don't get convicted for shame, right? Yeah.
I was thinking, as you were talking about a paper I read maybe 10, 12 years ago, it came out of the VA, and they were interested in moral injury, and they were kind of talking about moral injury as a way of understanding a cohort of soldiers who were more vulnerable to suicide, who had PTSD. So they're saying this group had PTSD, everybody has PTSD, but this group has more increased risk. And the idea was that this group was suffering from moral injury associated with what would happen in the theater of war or while they were in these roles, and then they would go back home and reflect, basically. And I've always, to me, there seems to be endless ways to apply that to other situations, like substance use, right. And also psychosis, the sort of lack of dignity that you or loss of dignity experience, right. That is followed by shame. I was kind of curious if you had run into those kinds of ideas, and it sounds like some of the literature you're looking at pointed towards that, maybe not with that word. And also if there's an association with risk that increases within psychosis when shame is unattended to, if you ran into things like that.
There's definitely literature that the higher the shame is, sort of the higher symptoms you might get. If there's heightened shame, then paranoia might be more likely, or potentially voices become more intense. I think that's definitely there. Moral injury is an interesting concept and how to think about that, and sort of what is the feelings associated with sort of behaving in ways that are that feel undignified or that violated one's own moral conscience. Usually in war, I guess there's sort of competing ideals, right, about what one's doing. You have some sort of notion of defending one's country or patriotism, but then often people do things that feel dehumanizing. Of course, in Vietnam, when you don't have, say, for instance, a strong belief in the moral nature of the war, then it becomes harder to justify having engaged in difficult or actions that feel embarrassing. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to think about moral injury in relation to psychosis. That's interesting. Yeah.
I wanted to comment on the difference between guilt and shame. Again, Dr. Garrett, when you said that, I thought about a patient of mine who uses the sense of guilt as a defense to his shame. So he would come in session and confess about, I didn't do chores again this week, I didn't do this again, I wasn't doing that. But he's able to access that sense of guilt. He felt responsible for that, but the sense of shame was far, far away. He was really feeling very vulnerable, but I think the guilt could be used in a way to temporarily make himself feel a little bit better and more in control of, I'm owning up to something and I feel good about something. I think I agree with you about the enrichment. There's something he's adding to the sense of self and the ego that he felt stronger in the moment.
It's interesting. I also I don't know if I'm playing devil's advocate with myself a little bit, but I remember there's some quote by Kohut or something like essentially that shame is the inverse of exhibitionism, and sort of the ways in which within the experience of shame, all eyes are on you. And so I think that there's a way that guilt, you can feel more comfortable with the sort of moral integrity to it, but I feel like with shame, there is more of that doubt around should I feel ashamed? Am I being grandiose by feeling shame here? I mean, so I think it's an interesting conflicted experience, and how we relate to it and how we do or not confer dignity to the experience and legitimacy to it. I think there's more doubt and shame than with guilt. It's a little more like, okay, I said something hateful or selfish, I can restore the relationship. It's hard to know how to restore one's own sense of dignity in the aftermath of shame. Yeah.
Relevant to that, I remember reading in what was, I think, still an unpublished dissertation many years ago, which surprised me because I think of guilt as terrible, where the author said that guilt is a much easier emotion than shame, because you can atone, you can expiate, you can do something that undoes the crime that you think you did. And I was interested in that, in your description of trying to get between your son and his shame. And I've had that experience many times with patients that I want to somehow interfere with this shame, but it's all self-contained, whereas guilt you can make a plan for.
Right. And you can offer forgiveness or apologize. I think people are very attached to their shame. Again, I think partly because it reflects aspirations they hold dearly, and it probably reflects insecurities about the body, about the mind that are very near to us. So I think that's an element. It does remind me of this paper I read a couple years ago around, it was a kind of critical piece around the sort of discussion around how we're living in an age in the West where sort of the old metaphysical frameworks of religion no longer sort of have legitimacy in a lot of people's minds. And yet we also still have a very punitive, judgmental society. One of the good things about religion, at least provides formal rituals by which one can be atoned for one's sins. We're now living in a very judgmental, merciless age where it's not really clear how one feels better or comes back from things. And so there is a way that, like, I don't know if you could say we live in a shame-prone society or guilt-prone, but there's a lot more criticalness, and yet it seems like a lack of mercy anywhere. So that's just...
Social media certainly is a very shaming environment and complicates.
And I think, to Brett's comments yesterday, I also do wonder about the pleasures of shame, but I didn't get into that in this paper as well. I think there's some complexity there. Yeah.
In terms of the distinction, relative to guilt and shame, I think there's an author, John Bradshaw, in the 90s, did a lot of work in the substance use disorder space. And sort of out of that, came this framework of guilt is about I made a mistake, and shame is about I am a mistake. And that deep internal sense of being unworthy and disconnected and not fitting in with others. And kind of along with that, another author comes to mind, Aaron Lazar, wrote a nice book on apology. And all that embraces kind of within those realms.
I'm curious. I like that word, curious. I'm thinking about, you said pleasures of shame. I'm wondering about a community of shame. Do you have any experience with group therapy or, let's say, in voice hearing network conversations of individuals who are experiencing psychosis with shame, actually talking with one another about that and finding sort of ways of supporting one another in that way?
I mean, I think that this is why peers are very important, why residential treatment centers, groups like these offer a profound, like, anti-shame space in a way, because there's this relief that I don't have to hide anymore, whatever symptoms might be troubling them, suicidal thoughts, voices, manic symptoms, depression. So I think there is this real, and I think also shame is usually more about peers than about, like, authority, in a way. So it's more about, do my peers accept me if I'm different? So I think that that's an important thing. I'm actually about to start leading a group on guilt and shame. So I can't tell you now, but in a couple of weeks I'll start that and see what it's like. But actually I did lead a group on self-esteem, and my experience is that there is a way, though, I think shame it's hard not to isolate oneself within it. So I do think it's sort of, it's easy to close, like turn in on the self. But I do think when people are coming together, it's like a Hearing Voices network, that can be a very powerful antidote to shame. But I do think it's a hard thing to deal with and metabolize. Yeah.
I was thinking about an experience with shame that I think may be common to everybody, and also especially to people who experience psychosis, is that shame can really kind of the underlying thing that's hard to get to is aloneness. And that's hard to talk about, it's hard to be atoned for. There's something that feels like it's about you, and nothing will help you. Right? There's no out of it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think in many ways the solution to shame is often aloneness, kind of withdrawing and hiding from people so as to prevent the exposure of something. I try to write in the paper too, though, about how the expression of dependency or the wish to connect, though, can be so linked with shame. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to say, I need you, or I want to talk with you. And so I think obviously expressing longing, which is one way to think about loneliness, people are struggling to know what to do with their longing, and they don't feel like there's anyone to receive it. It requires often stomaching shame and being able to sort of push through that and ask for help, ask for support, to flag that not everything's okay here. So I think that's a big part of it. Okay, thanks.